Thank you. After returning from a trip to Spain, a teenager with a blotchy rash attended an REM concert at the Spectrum in Philly. A couple weeks later, several other teenagers got sick. This was when measles entered our city. Now, this was the headline that appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer on May 21st of 1990, and from the title, one would assume that measles, there's a somewhat comical title suggesting that measles is benign, a sort of childhood rite of passage. Not true. The measles vaccine was actually first introduced in the United States in 1963. Prior to that, every year the United States would suffer about 3 to 4 million cases of measles. There were 48,000 hospitalizations, at least 500 deaths. Almost everyone who was infected was less than 15 years of age, and deaths were typically caused by pneumonia, encephalitis, or dehydration. Now, by 1978, because the measles vaccine works, only 27,000 cases of measles were reported. The CDC, encouraged by this, launched what they felt was what they called the Measles Elimination Program, with the goal to eliminate measles by 1982. In 1983, only 1,500 cases were reported, but in 1989, measles came back. Now, on June 2nd, 1990, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Because there was a growing trend in the United States for more cases and more deaths. As of May 19th, 1990, there were 35 deaths from measles, but there were 41 deaths reported for all of 1989. So the trend was one of more cases, more deaths. And so the CDC then urged an action. So this was the headline on the Philadelphia Inquirer on June 12th, 1990. So what the CDC wanted to do was, at the time, children were receiving only 1 dose of measles vaccine at around 15 months of age. Now they recommended a second dose in middle school. The main reason really was to give children a second chance to get a first dose, but by having a 2-dose schedule, that increased the efficacy of the vaccine from about 95% to 99.5%. So the measles in Philly was a growing problem. By November 29th of 1990, there were 96 Philadelphia children who were infected with measles. By December 7th, that number increased to 124. By December 31st, that number increased to 258. And also in December of 1990, an 18-month-old boy died from measles pneumonia, and it was the first measles death in our city in 20 years. On June 12, 1990, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. This was a second death. Like the first death, it was an unimmunized child. And so the Philadelphia health commissioner, fearing that this was a huge problem in our city, lowered the first dose age for vaccination from 15 months of age to 6 months of age. And 7 weeks after this happened, something happened in our city that had never happened before and has never happened since, in any city for that matter. Now, the commissioner at the time, the commissioner of health of the city of Philadelphia, was Dr. Bob Ross. On January 16, 1991, he received an anonymous phone call from a woman whose daughter belonged to the Faith Tabernacle Church in North Philadelphia. The woman warned Ross that the church members don't believe in medical care, certainly not in vaccines. Ross said no one had died yet, but for the first time we worried that we might not hear about a case of measles until a church member calls the police or calls the coroner to pick up the body. Now, the doctrine of the Faith Tabernacle Church instructs members to, quote, believe that the Bible is opposed to all means of healing apart from God's way. Quote, if I go to God and ask him to heal my body, said church member Gordon Korn, I can't go to a doctor for medicine. You either trust God or you trust man. Now, the church school, and they had their own school from nursery school up to the 12th grade, contained hundreds of children, none of whom were immunized. Actually, the Faith Tabernacle Church still exists in Philadelphia. It's at 5th and Erie. It still has a fairly large congregation. On February 11th of 1991, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. So on February 7th, so 4 days before that article, Karen Sill, a 9-year-old girl, was pronounced dead from measles. And on February 10th, Monica Johnson, a classmate, also both from Faith Tabernacle, was also pronounced dead. Monica was one of 11 children in the home, all of whom were unimmunized. Monica's father was a teacher at the school and said, quote, I feel very confident in my belief in the way I've raised my children. He says, Monica is something that God has given us and now has taken away. Now, after Karen Sill's death, Ross meets with the Reverend Charles Reinert, who was a pastor of the Faith Tabernacle Church, and his recollection of the event is as follows, quote, "He was soft-spoken, the consummate gentleman, but he drove us nuts. We told him we needed to vaccinate everyone in the school, but he said that family wouldn't let us do it." On February 12th, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer. So this is really the first step that was done by the Philadelphia court system, which was to allow Ross and his co-workers to actually visit the families, but they weren't allowed to actually touch the children. They had to look through the door and at a glance decide whether or not they were in dire straits. Quote, "Most of the families had 6, 8, 10, 12 kids because they didn't believe in birth control," says Ross. "There were also a lot of kids who were physically or mentally disabled because they all had in-house deliveries. Even if the kids were born breech, they didn't do a C-section or cesarean section. It was like the old days." Ross finds the children appear well. Quote, "These kids had a rash, they were lying in bed, but they were alert, conversant, and appeared well hydrated. But he pleads with parents to let him know if any of these kids get sick enough that they require medical attention, but he's whispering in the wind." On February 15th of 1991, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer. So on February 14th, police were called to the home of Lynette Milnes, who's pronounced dead. Milnes doesn't attend Faith Tabernacle School, but her sister does. Lynette's 7 brothers and sisters, all of whom live in the home, are also unimmunized. Quote, "When another kid turned up at the morgue, I checked my list and realized she was on it," said Ross. "I had just called this mother and she told me her kids were fine. She'd lied to me." So Ross refers the case to Ron Castile, who was the district attorney for the city of Philadelphia, who considered filing criminal charges but demurred. Quote, "Unfortunately, when the parent is willing to risk the death of their children because of religious beliefs," says Castile, "it's unlikely that the threat of prosecution will in any way act as a deterrent." So then the Philadelphia court system takes its second step, which is when Ross realizes that the information he's getting is inaccurate, he gets a court order to physically examine the children. And at the time, he enlists residents at the 2 major hospitals in our city, which is Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and St. Christopher's Hospital for Children, to ask them basically to go door to door to examine all of these children who are part of this church. Quote, "It was one of the more inspiring moments in my 30 years in healthcare," says Ross. "These are busy people on call every 3rd night, yet they're happy to do it." On February 15th, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia's Daily News. In the early morning hours of February 15th, Nancy Evans, who's a 5-year-old from north central Philadelphia, dies from measles. Now, she didn't belong to the Faith Tabernacle Church. She belonged to another faith healing church in the northeastern part of the city, the First Century Gospel Church. Also on February 15th, Tina Louise Johnson, who was the 13-year-old sister of Monica Johnson, who had previously died, also dies on the day of Monica's funeral. Neither Nancy Evans nor Tina Johnson were taken to a doctor when their illnesses worsened. So, 5 children have died in 10 days. This is 1991. This is almost 30 years into the development of a measles vaccine, yet our city is in a panic because we are having children die of a preventable illness. So in the U.S. at the time, about 1 in 1,000 infected children died from measles. In some developing world countries, that rate can reach as high as 1 in 300. But in Philadelphia, 4 of 150 children with measles who attend the Faith Tabernacle Church are dead, a death rate of 1 in 35. So the CDC sent a team to investigate on February 15th of 91 because they wanted to determine why the death rate was so high in the city. Was it because this strain that was circulating was particularly virulent? Bill Atkinson actually headed that effort and found that the measles deaths had nothing to do with the circulating strain and everything to do with the parents. Children were dying because they weren't getting intravenous fluids for severe dehydration or oxygen for their pneumonia. On February 18th, this headline appears in the Inquirer. So Charles Reinert had actually chosen not to speak to the media for a long time, but as the media coverage or the press coverage of this event became worse and worse for him, and his religion or his group was called a cult, he decided to speak out. Quote, "The devil has tried to put fears in people's hearts. Job was robbed of everything he had. As he went through the trial, he learned from it. There is no fear when you can see God on your side." Reinert sees deaths in his church as a test of his faith, a test he has every intention of passing. Quote, "It's drawing us all together," he says. Now we take the next step. Ross asks the mayor, who was Wilson Good at the time, to obtain a court order to hospitalize children who were critically ill. With the telephone number of a judge in hand, then these residents from Children's Hospital Philadelphia and St. Chris's examined children from Faith Tabernacle Church. Quote, "It was like entering a time warp," said Mark Jaffe, who headed St. Chris's team. "With the exception of the fact that they stay at home and watch their children die from measles, they seem like wonderful people." On February 18, 1991, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And it's centered on a boy named Daniel Kern, who was 4 years old, developed measles pneumonia. A healthcare worker insisted on admitting him to the hospital. Now they're basically compelling these parents to get medical care. And it's not just a matter of examining them in the home. They now have to enter the healthcare system by coming to a hospital when they're ill. The parents politely but firmly refuse. So Bob Ross calls city solicitor Sharice Lilly, who calls family court judge Edward Summer, who gets an emergency order to hospitalize the boy. And a second child, 1-year-old named Bianca Carpina, is also hospitalized against her parents' will. So Philadelphia epidemic at this point is at its peak. At Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, 82 children are seen in the emergency department. 28 have been hospitalized. At St. Chris's, 250 children are seen in the ED, and 3 are being hospitalized every week. Ross and his team have visited 80 families and 500 children, but predicts correctly there will be more measles deaths in the city of Philadelphia. On February 21st, this headline appears in the Daily News. So Philadelphia is now a feared destination. 2 nearby schools canceled trips to the city. The city prints 50,000 educational pamphlets and is vaccinating hundreds of school children every week. The state of Pennsylvania sends $100,000 in federal funds to try and help with this massive effort to try and contain this outbreak. On February 27, 1991, Mayor Wilson Good asked City Solicitor's Office to obtain a court order to forcibly vaccinate children. In other words, to compel vaccination. We don't do that in this country. In this country, what we do is we mandate vaccination depending on the state or the locale and depending on the vaccine. A mandatory vaccine means you are asked to get a vaccine. If you don't get a vaccine, then you may not be able to go to the school you want to go to. At Children's Hospital Philadelphia, we ask people to get an influenza vaccine, all healthcare workers. If you choose not to get an influenza vaccine in our hospital, and you're a healthcare worker in our hospital, you can walk into a child's room. You were given 2 weeks of unpaid leave to think about it. If you still don't want to get a vaccine, then you don't get to work in our hospital anymore. But nowhere really in the history of American jurisprudence have we ever compelled vaccination, which is to say you or your child are pinned down and vaccinated whether you want to be or not. And that's what happened here. There was a court order obtained to forcibly vaccinate children. Now, according to the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution, states are permitted to compel vaccination. It all stems initially from a 1905 event that occurred in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when Cambridge was suffering a massive smallpox epidemic. Henning Jacobson was a Lutheran minister. He believed that God would protect him. He refused to get a smallpox vaccine, and he also refused to pay the $5 fine that he was asked to pay if he refused to get that vaccine. That case went from local courts to state courts and ultimately up to the United States Supreme Court, where writing for the majority, John Marshall Harlan, who was the Chief Justice at the time, said this, quote, "The liberty secured by the Constitution of the United States does not import an absolute right to be wholly freed from restraint. There are manifold restraints to which every person is necessarily subjected for the common good. Society based on the rule that each one is a law unto himself would soon be confronted with anarchy and disorder." In other words, he concluded that it was not an American citizen's inalienable right to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection. Now this issue went before the Supreme Court one more time. It was the case of Rosalind Zucht, who was a high school student in San Antonio, Texas, who also refused to get a smallpox vaccine, which caused her to be expelled from her school. Now at the time, the difference between this case and the Jacobson case is smallpox was not epidemic at the time in San Antonio, Texas. But despite that, the Supreme Court still again upheld the ruling that was made in Jacobson v. Massachusetts. Now, things started to unravel actually in New York, because bad things come from New York. I'm sorry, I'm a Philadelphia sports fan. You know, the Mets, the Yankees. the Giants, for goodness sake. But in any case, the New York State Assembly in 1966 considered a bill about requiring polio vaccine for school entry. Now, the bill passed by a vote of 150 to 2. There were 2 dissenters, and the reason that those 2 people dissented is because the bill excluded parents whose religion forbade vaccination, which was really a direct result of the lobbying efforts of Christian scientists. So this opened the door. Now you could make a claim. You could make a First Amendment claim that said, I am being discriminated against on the basis of my religion because I'm not a Christian scientist, and therefore I'm being forced to get a vaccine. And that really opened the door to the point that now we have 41 states that have religious exemptions to vaccination, and Pennsylvania is one of them. So on February 28, 1991, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer, as now we were pushing to try and essentially force these children to be vaccinated, because this is no way to run a healthcare system. I mean, it's much easier to try and prevent a disease than to treat the disease once it's already happened. Right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Everybody who works at the University of Pennsylvania has to have one Ben Franklin quote at least during your talk. So that's that. So the thinking at the time was that the Charles Reinhardt basically sought out. Now remember, there is a law on the books permitting a religious exemption to vaccination at the time. This was not going to be an easy climb, one imagined, for the city of Philadelphia. And so Reinhardt sought out the American Civil Liberties Union to defend him. Now this is a group that certainly has been perfectly willing to take on controversial cases. It was the ACLU that represented the Dove World Outreach Center when they wanted their children to wear to high school a t-shirt that said Islam is of the devil. It was the ACLU that was perfectly willing to represent the Westboro Baptist Church of Eastern Missouri when they wanted to protest funerals for soldiers who had recently returned dead from various wars, including more recently the war in Iraq. Because they believed that Americans were being punished for their willingness to accept homosexuality, and this was the form of that punishment, soldiers being killed. So they would protest at these funerals, and they have their website is godhatesfags.com. And most famously, in 1977, the ACLU was willing to represent neo-Nazis when they wanted to march down the streets of Skokie, a home to many Jews in the Chicago area community, including Holocaust survivors, which led the Onion, I think in one of its better articles, to satirize the ACLU at least at one time, saying ACLU defends Nazis' right to burn down ACLU headquarters. But interestingly, on March 2nd, 1991, the ACLU declined to help parents who were asking to not be vaccinated in accordance with state law. The Deborah Levy, who was the head of the Philadelphia chapter of the ACLU, said, quote, "There is certainly a free exercise of religion claimed by the parents, but there's also a competing claim that parents don't have the right to martyr their children. I don't think we've walked away from our principles here." So, on March 2nd, this headline appeared. So the lawyer who was representing the parents was a guy named Jerome Balter, and he argued that he protested that, he basically protested that decision that was made, and said their healing is dependent on their faith. They believe that that's the right thing to do for their children. Now the judge ruled in favor of the city, but Balter then took that case to the appeals court, which is to say the Pennsylvania Superior Court of Appeals. Where Judge Vincent Cirillo heard the case. And during the case, Sean Lacey actually was representing the children, Balter was representing the parents, and Cirillo noted a pained expression on Lacey's face very early on in the hearing. And "Are you ill?" he asked. And Lacey had just been handed a note concerning a 20-month-old boy, James Jones, whose parents were members of the Faith Tabernacle Church, who had, as is shown in this slide, died of measles encephalitis. So Balter then argued that parents are now willing to allow sick children to be admitted to the hospital, but he still didn't want them to have to be vaccinated, implying that treatment is as good as prevention, which certainly the events of the previous couple months didn't support. So on March 9th, 5 children were vaccinated, as shown in this headline, and as were actually a number of children in a series of episodes that occurred in the few weeks that followed. And by June 7th, as is true, frankly, always for measles epidemic, by the summer, the measles epidemic had subsided. Quote, typically measles is a disease of late winter and early spring, said Bob Levinson, who was the director of disease control. When the warm weather comes, the cases disappeared. Reinert didn't see it that way. He had a different interpretation, even though pretty much everybody in his community had either been naturally infected in the past, recently infected, or died from this disease. He focused on the children in his church who'd survived, saying that the infection, saying that we believe that God has provided his faithfulness. So on December 3rd, 1992, there was the group that was headed by Bill Atkinson that had evaluated this outbreak, reported on it. Among church members, 486 people were infected and 6 killed. Among 9 non-church members, because not surprisingly, the disease spread outside of that epicenter of the church group into the surrounding community. 938 people were infected and 3 were killed. All 9 deaths were in children. The attack rate in church members was about 1,000-fold greater than that in the surrounding community. And this is an article that was reported in the Pediatric Infectious Disease Journal. In 2013, the CDC identified at least 30,000 children whose parents had chosen not to vaccinate them for religious reasons. Given the underreporting and the insular nature of many of these faith healing groups, the number is probably much larger. And just to put this in perspective, and then I just have one more slide. Last year in the United States, there were 189 cases of measles reported. By the end of March this year, we had about 106 cases reported. If that then trend continues, we can assume there'll be about 400 cases this year. If this trend continues, if we get to about 600 or 700 cases in this country, we'll start to see measles deaths again. It's a lesson you would like to think we don't have to learn again, but it sounds like we might. So I'll close just with this slide. Why do we allow such a profoundly unreligious act to be performed in the name of religion? Thank you.